A dog that won't cross one gate, in a barn full of gates, for reasons the staff have stopped trying to guess. That was the thing nobody at Millrace Creek could explain, and it was the thing the two of them were still arguing about when the truck pulled in. "He's not on today's sheet," said Priya, the younger of the two volunteers, elbows on the fence rail, eyes on the gravel lot. "I checked twice." "Doesn't need to be on the sheet. He's the walk-in nobody called," Elise Northcott said, not slowing as she crossed behind them toward the office, clipboard board under one arm, pen already tapping the top corner of her run sheet. Every shelter's got one. Somebody's uncle, somebody who read a headline once. The truck was a faded blue 3/4 ton with a dent along the passenger door, the shape of a fence post, and it sat idling at the edge of the gravel with the patience of something that had idled there before, though neither of them could have said when. An old man sat behind the wheel without cutting the engine, hands resting on top of it, watching the barn the way a man watches a house he used to live in. "He's just sitting there," Priya said. "They do that," Elise said. "Sit there, work up their nerve, then come in and ask for the one we can't give away." She didn't wait to see if Priya laughed. If you've ever watched an animal remember someone before you did, you already know where this is going, and something in the background already did. 3 stalls down, in the shadowed end of the kennel building where the concrete stayed cool even in June, a Belgian Malinois with a gray muzzle and one hip that dropped slightly when she turned, came up off her cot and went rigid at full attention, ears forward, weight balanced dead center over all 4 feet, staring at a door none of the humans in the lot could see through. Nobody in the yard saw it happen. That was the thing about Kestrel by then. 11 weeks into a placement freeze, on a euthanasia list that would be posted by 9 that morning, she had gotten very good at being unremarkable for people who were watching, and very exact for the 10 seconds when no one was. The truck's engine ticked once, cooling though it hadn't been running long enough to need to. Behind the barn, past the exercise yard, past the 2 long rows of chain-link runs, there stood a smaller building the shelter's own staff called the Old Equipment Shed, though nobody currently on payroll could say with any authority what was in it, only that it had a chain and a padlock instead of a knob, and that when anyone tried to walk a certain dog anywhere near it, she planted her feet and would not be led another inch, gentle as a Sunday, and just as immovable. Elise had noted the behavior in Kestrel's file as handler-dependent aversion, cause unclear, non-priority. She had not opened the shed. She had, in fairness, opened almost everything else that morning. Arrival logs, transport manifests, the euthanasia track list that would go up on the corkboard within the hour with Kestrel's intake number near the bottom, a signature line beside it still blank. The truck door opened with the particular reluctance of a hinge that has been oiled by someone who does his own work, and does it well, but not often. An old man swung one leg out, then the other, moving like a man conserving something he only had a certain amount of left. He wore a canvas coat the color of wet slate, buttoned crooked at the collar as though he'd done it without a mirror, which he had. He did not look toward the office. He looked first toward the back runs, the way a man checks a horizon before he checks anything closer. "Sir," Elise called from the steps, not unkindly exactly, just flatly, the way she said most things before 8 in the morning. "We're not doing intakes today. And if you're here about a specific animal, I'd need to see some paperwork showing prior ownership or a fostering history. And I'll tell you now, we don't have either on file for most of what's back there." The old man closed the truck door with the flat of his hand, not slamming it, just settling it, and reached into the truck bed, where a folded shape lay wrapped in the collar of an old feed sack, its stitching visible at one corner, dark leather gone the color of a saddle left out through 40 winters. "I'm not here about paperwork," he said. Cyrus Dunbar had been waved off from better desks than this one, and he took it the way he took most things that weren't worth the breath of an argument, without visible offense, without hurrying, and without leaving. He left the harness in the truck bed for now, folded the way he'd folded it 100 times, buckle recut decades back to a pattern only his own hands would remember cutting, and walked toward the front doors of the shelter office with the gait of a man whose right shoulder had quietly stopped rising past his own chest sometime in the last 10 years and had simply never mentioned it to anyone. He didn't reach for door handles with that arm anymore. He'd built a whole economy of motion around not needing to, and it read, to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, as stiffness, maybe arthritis, maybe just old age doing what old age does. It wasn't stiffness. It was discipline that had outlived its own explanation. The girl behind the front desk, 19, name-tagged Priya, the same one who'd been at the fence a minute before, looked up from a stack of transfer folders with the particular blankness of someone trained to be polite to strangers and unsure yet whether this stranger required it. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to sit with the Malinois. Back row, gray around the muzzle, older dog." "That's Kestrel. She's, Priya glanced toward the hallway, toward Elise's office door, weighing whether this required an adult. "She's on a restricted list right now. Staff only, mostly. Are you with a rescue?" "No." "Family?" "No." He didn't offer more, and there was nothing performative in the silence that followed. No wounded pause built for effect, just a man giving an honest, complete answer and letting it stand. "I'd like 10 minutes with her. I don't need to take her anywhere." "I can't authorize that without—" "I understand," Cyrus said, and he did seem to, entirely, without rancor, the way a man understands weather. He turned for the door, boots quiet on the tile, and paused only once at the end of the hall where a wire mesh window looked out over the runs. Far at the back, past the concrete apron, the padlocked shed sat catching the early light on its tin roof, chain looped twice through the hasp. He looked at it the way he'd looked at the horizon from the truck. Then he went back out to his vehicle and did not leave the lot. He backed the truck instead into the shade at the edge of the gravel, cut the engine this time, and sat. In the truck bed, tucked well back under the wheel well where the sun wouldn't get at it and no one glancing in would think to look, there was a second shape besides the harness, a folded quilt, hand-stitched, its pattern faded to the soft undyed color of things washed 1,000 times, laid flat and square the way a person squares a thing they intend to keep squared. He did not take it out. He looked at it once, the way another man might check a wallet was still in his pocket, and then he closed the tailgate gently and walked back toward the fence line, where he could see, if he stood at the right angle, the shadowed end of the kennel row and, in it, if he waited, the shape of a dog who had gone still the moment his engine first sounded in the lot and had not entirely settled since. 20 feet away, behind glass, Elise Northcott was already explaining herself to someone else, because that was simply the rhythm of her mornings. Teach as you triage, whether anyone had asked to be taught or not. "The board isn't cruelty, it's math," she was saying to the intern, trailing her down the row with a tablet she wasn't using, because Elise preferred paper for this, preferred the run sheet clipped to its hardboard where she could feel the numbers under her thumb. Every dog gets 4 scores. Medical cost to place, behavioral risk, time to adoption likelihood based on breed and age, space cost per week held. You add them, you get a single number, and the number tells you what 14 years of doing this the emotional way never could, who we can actually save instead of who we feel bad about. She stopped at a run 3 doors down from Kestrel's, where a lean brindle mix paced a tight, anxious oval, foam-flecked at the lips from a morning of hard breathing. "This one," Elise said, crouching, voice dropping half a register, gentler than the intern expected. "Bloat risk, resource guarding on intake, 31 days held already. Most places would have moved on this dog a week ago. I'm not moving on him yet. Because look," she pointed, and the intern looked and saw, once it was pointed out, that the dog's pacing wasn't panic, it was a search, nose low along the same 6 feet of chain link, over and over, like a man patting his pockets for keys he was sure he'd had a minute ago. That's not fear pacing, that's scent fixation. Somebody worked with this dog. I want 2 more days on him before he goes on any list, because my gut says there's a handle here the sheet doesn't show yet, and I'm not wrong about that kind of thing very often. She was right about the brindle dog. She would be right about him for the rest of the week, hold him past his own board score on nothing but a hunch that turned out to be sound judgment dressed as a rule break. And nobody watching her crouch there in the morning light would have called that anything but competence, because it was. She stood, dusted her knees, and kept moving, the intern trotting to keep pace. And that was when she passed the fence line and found the old man standing at it, hands loose at his sides, watching the back row. "You again," she said, not unpleasantly, just noting a fact. "Priya said you wanted 10 minutes with the Malinois." "I did, still would. I appreciate that you care, I do." She tapped the board twice with her pen, a small closing gesture, the kind she used at the end of a decision already made. "But that dog's file is complicated right now, And I've got to transport out Saturday morning and 40 animals to make defensible calls on before then. And what I don't have time for is a sentimental visit from somebody with no ownership history and no fostering record standing at my fence, hoping proximity fixes a scoring problem. If you want to help, there's an adoption fair Sunday. This isn't that. I understand the deadline, Cyrus said. Then you understand why I can't let random members of the public back there for feel-good time with a dog on a restricted track. It isn't personal. No, he agreed, mild as still water. I don't imagine it is. She left him at the fence and didn't look back to see whether he left too. He didn't. He found an overturned 5-gallon bucket near the tool shed, the kind used for hauling feed or scrubbing runs, righted it a few feet from Kestrel's chain link out of the main foot traffic, and sat down on it with the unhurried finality of a man who has decided something and intends to let the deciding do its own work over time, without announcement. That evening at 6, when the shelter's day staff had gone, and only the kennel lights buzzed low over the back row, Austin Rainey came around the side of the barn on his way to lock the feed shed and stopped hard enough that his boots skidded half an inch in the gravel. He'd been suspended from his volunteer shift 3 hours earlier for saying, too loudly, in front of the wrong person, that moving Kestrel to the transport list without a current behavioral reassessment was going to get somebody's mistake blamed on a dog who couldn't file a complaint about it. He still had his keys to the feed shed because nobody had thought to ask for them back yet. He used the walk to the shed as an excuse to pass the runs one more time, the way a man visits a hospital room after visiting hours, technically not allowed, quietly unable to stay away. And there, at 6:04 in the evening by his own watch, was the old farmer from that morning, sitting on an overturned bucket outside Kestrel's chain link, not talking, not reaching through the fence, just present, the way a fence post is present, and Kestrel lying on her cot with her chin on her paws, and her eyes open and fixed on him in a way Austin had not seen her fix on anyone since the day the department's van had come to collect the last of the unit's equipment and left her behind with it. "She know you?" Austin asked, because it was the only question that made any sense to ask. "Not yet," Cyrus said, without turning his head. "Working on it." Austin came back the next evening, Wednesday, at 5:40, and again Cyrus was on the bucket, coat collar still buttoned wrong, saying almost nothing, occasionally lifting 2 fingers in some small gesture Austin couldn't read from that angle, and Kestrel's ears would flick and settle, the reaction of a dog listening for a language she hadn't heard spoken correctly in longer than Austin had known her. By Thursday, 6:10 in the evening, Austin had stopped pretending he was just passing through on his way to the feed shed and sat down on an overturned bucket of his own, a respectful 10 feet off, and didn't ask anything at all for the better part of 20 minutes, because some part of him, the part that had trained under a sergeant who used to say a good handler reads the dog before he reads the manual, had started to suspect that what he was watching wasn't a stranger trying to make friends with a nervous animal. It was closer to 2 old soldiers relearning the sound of each other's boots. "They're going to run her out Saturday," Austin finally said, "on the transport truck. Northcott's already got the paperwork staged." "I know. You don't seem worried about it." Cyrus was quiet long enough that Austin thought he might not answer at all. "Worry doesn't run a search pattern," he said finally. "Time does. I've got some left. I intend to use it." Friday evening, 6:05, Austin didn't come around the barn pretending anything. He came straight to the bucket and sat down on his own, and when Cyrus rose, slower now, weight shifting through his knees in a sequence he'd clearly done the same way for years, hand never once going to that right shoulder to brace it, because bracing wasn't how he'd learned to move, and walked to the gate of Kestrel's run, Austin's whole chest went tight with something he hadn't let himself feel in 11 weeks, which was hope built on no evidence he could have defended to Elise Northcott or to anyone else with a clipboard. 10 minutes, Cyrus told the desk that evening, and this time it was Austin, not Priya, who unlocked the run, suspension or no suspension, because some decisions a man makes with his keys before he makes them with his job. Cyrus didn't clip a lead to Kestrel's collar. He walked her out through the gate on nothing but the set of his own shoulders, into the graveled exercise yard where the evening light lay long and orange across the fence line, and there he stopped, faced her, and lifted his right arm as far as it would go, which was not far, and turned his forearm out, wrist bent, fingers spread, A signal so far outside current department doctrine that Austin, 4 years a handler himself, had never once seen it taught, only heard it referenced, the way men reference a retired play nobody runs anymore. Kestrel sat. He gave a second signal, smaller, 2 fingers turned down against his palm, and she came up and cast left in a wide, deliberate arc, nose low, hip dropping and rising in the gait that had ended her career and never once slowed her working nose, and swept the first quadrant of the yard the way a combine works a field. Methodical, no wasted ground, back to him inside of 40 seconds for the next signal, which he gave before she'd even fully settled, because he already knew, the way a man knows his own handwriting, exactly how fast she'd come back. Point 3. Point 4. She hit a scent article Austin hadn't even known was hidden along the fence base, a scrap of leather Cyrus must have dropped without either of them seeing him do it, and sat beside it, rigid, staring back at him for the next command, and did not break that stare, even when, behind them, the office door banged open, and Elise Northcott came out mid-sentence into a phone she was still holding to her ear, because Priya had come and gotten her out of a call with the transport vendor to say, flatly, "You need to see this." Point 5, 6, 7. The whole yard had gone the particular kind of quiet that isn't the absence of sound, so much as the sudden withdrawal of every other kind of attention, every staff member and every kenneled dog within earshot fixed on one gray-muzzled Malinois, running a search pattern for a stranger she had known, by any fair account, for exactly 4 evenings. Point 8, point 9. She finished at his feet, sat, and looked up at him the way a dog looks at the one person in a yard full of people who has never once had to raise his voice to be understood. Cyrus lowered his arm. "Kestrel," he said. Just her name. Nothing more. It was the only word he'd spoken above a murmur all evening, and it landed in that yard like a verdict. Elise Northcott stood at the office door with the phone still against her ear, the transport vendor's voice tinning on unheard, and for 3 full seconds she did not say anything at all, because there was nothing on her run sheet, in any column, under any score, that accounted for what she had just watched a dog on a euthanasia track, do for a man with no ownership history and no fostering record, using commands that predated the department's current training manual by the better part of 2 decades. "Where?" she said finally, lowering the phone without ending the call. "Did you learn to give those signals?" "Taught them," Cyrus said. "Long time back, to a man who taught a man who trained her first handler, near as I can figure it." The number that Elise Northcott could not stop turning over in her head, once the yard had emptied and the evening had gone the flat gray of a summer dusk, was not a viability score. It was a date, Saturday, 8 o'clock, when the signature line beside Kestrel's intake number would either carry a name or the transport truck would carry the dog. She had built her whole system on the premise that numbers didn't lie, and now she had a man in a wrong-buttoned barn coat standing in her exercise yard, having just made every number on that sheet look like it was measuring the wrong thing entirely, and she did not have the luxury of sitting with that discomfort because the vendor was still on hold and the truck was still coming. "That was impressive," she said, and meant it, which cost her something to say. "It doesn't change the deadline. I need documentation, training history, department verification, something I can put in a file. Before, I can pull an animal off a scheduled transport, and I need it by Saturday morning, and I don't currently have a way to get you that fast because the department that ran this unit doesn't exist anymore to verify anything for me." "I understand the trouble you're in," Cyrus said, and she believed that he did, entirely, the way he seemed to understand every piece of trouble anyone put in front of him without once making it about his own. The trouble, as it turned out, ran 2 directions at once. Austin's suspension, made official in writing by Friday morning, meant he could no longer let himself or anyone else into the back runs without a supervisor present, which meant Cyrus's only inside advocate had just lost his keys along with his shift, at the precise moment proving Friday evening's pattern wasn't a fluke, required somebody with authority to open a gate. And when Austin, working the shelter's landline from the parking lot because he wasn't supposed to be inside the building at all anymore, tried the one number that might actually move Elise's deadline, Chief Rowan Grubbs, retired, the only man in 3 counties whose signature could override a transport order on his say-so alone, he got a receptionist at a banquet hall 3 hours east, who informed him, not unkindly, that the chief was mid-ceremony at his own retirement dinner, phone off, and would not be reachable again until sometime after breakfast the next morning. "Sometime after breakfast," Austin repeated into the phone, standing in the gravel lot with the barn lights coming on behind him, "is Saturday, the truck's Saturday morning." Cyrus, leaning against his truck bed with the harness still folded in its feed sack beside him, absorbed this the way he absorbed most bad news, without any visible change in his posture, though something did tighten briefly in the set of his jaw. "Then we've got tonight," he said, "and whatever's true stays true whether we can prove it by 8 o'clock or not. That's not going to matter much to Northcott's paperwork." "No," Cyrus agreed, "it won't." What neither of them said, because neither of them had proof of it yet, only the accumulated weight of watching a dog refuse one door in a barn full of doors, was that Cyrus intended to find out, before Saturday's truck idled in that lot, exactly what was behind the padlocked shed Kestrel would not walk past, because a dog with that kind of discipline did not fear an empty building for no reason, and Cyrus Dunbar had spent 47 years learning that the reasons animals gave you were usually better evidence than the reasons people wrote down on paper. He found Priya at the front desk a little after 7 that evening, the lot otherwise emptied, Austin banned from the property proper and pacing the gravel outside like a man keeping vigil at a hospital he wasn't allowed inside. "That shed out back," Cyrus said. "Who's got the key?" "Maintenance, I think, or maybe nobody. Half our keys are for locks nobody's used since the old K9 program folded." Priya hesitated, some old habit of caution warring with 3 days of watching a dog nobody could explain go calm around a man nobody had vetted. "There's a spare board in the office. It's not really my call to let you back there." "I know it isn't," Cyrus said. "I'm asking anyway." She got the board down herself, an act of quiet insubordination that would cost her nothing in the end, because by morning the whole shape of the shelter's chain of command would have shifted enough that nobody would think to write her up for it. The lock was old, the kind that turned reluctantly, rust flaking off the hasp in a fine orange dust that caught the last of the evening light, and when the chain finally slid free and the door swung in on a hinge that hadn't been oiled since the unit that once used this shed had still had a budget. The smell of stored canvas and old motor oil rolled out into the dusk, and Cyrus stood in the doorway a moment before he stepped through, the way a man stands at the edge of a room he already half remembers. Inside, stacked against the far wall under a tarp gone stiff with dust, was everything the county's defunded K9 unit had left behind when its funding disappeared and its shelter contract lapsed 11 weeks before. Collapsed agility tunnels, a rack of old leads, a filing box of intake cards nobody had thought worth digitizing, and, on a shelf built low enough that a man Cyrus's height didn't have to reach for it, a logbook, spiral-bound, its cover soft with handling, the department's old seal still legible on the front. He carried it out into the last of the light and read by it, standing, the way a man reads something he already suspects the shape of before he's confirmed it. The entries for Kestrel's final 3 field assessments were there, dated, initialed, each one marked with a lower score than the one before, and beside each date, in a different hand, a scheduling note. Handler reassigned, no cover officer available, assessment conducted by contract evaluator. The scores had been logged, plainly, after the department's own paperwork showed Kestrel had already been pulled from active duty over a staffing gap that had nothing to do with her, a scheduling failure dressed up 3 separate times as a performance 1. Headlights swept the gravel lot behind him before he'd finished reading, and a car he didn't recognize pulled in fast enough to throw dust, and out of it climbed a heavy-set man in a sport coat with his tie already loosened from a dinner he'd left in the middle of, moving with the particular urgency of someone who has just spent 3 hours at a banquet being told what a fine career he'd had and has not stopped thinking the entire time about a voicemail he only heard when he stepped out for air. "Cyrus Dunbar," the man said, stopping 10 feet off, and something in his voice didn't finish the way a greeting usually does. It caught mid-name, and he had to start the next sentence over. "I got Austin's message an hour into my own dinner. Took me that long to convince myself I wasn't imagining the name." "Rowan," Cyrus said, and that was all, though the single word carried the whole weight of 31 years in it. Chief Rowan Grubbs stood there a moment longer than the moment required, then reached into his sport coat past his own retirement plaque, still wrapped in tissue paper on the passenger seat, and drew out nothing at all, just stood with his hand inside his coat as though he'd meant to produce something and found instead that there was nothing in the gesture that could match what he actually owed. "You know why I came the second I heard your name on that voicemail," he said. "You know I wasn't coming for a dog." "I didn't ask you here for either," Cyrus said. "The dog needed a door opened. Austin needed somebody with rank behind him. That's the whole of it." "That's not the whole of it, and you know it isn't." Grubbs's voice had lost every ceremonial polish it had worn an hour ago at his own dinner table. 31 years ago, you tracked 11 miles of washed-out creek bottom on a scent article nobody thought would hold after that much rain, and you found my daughter alive under a footbridge 2 days after every trained team the county had access to called it. I've spent 3 decades being introduced as a man with a distinguished career, and every single year of it, I've known exactly whose work made the rest of it possible to have. You paid that, Cyrus said, long since. I never paid a nickel of it. You don't pay a thing like that in nickels. Cyrus closed the logbook gently, the way he'd have closed a Bible, and held it out. I need your signature on something else tonight. Not for me. Grubbs took the logbook, read the scheduling notes by his own phone's flashlight, and his jaw set the way a man's jaw sets when he recognizes, in someone else's cut corner, the same shape of corner cutting. He spent a whole career trying to stamp out of departments smaller and less careful than his own. "This isn't a performance record," he said. "This is somebody protecting a budget line and calling it a dog's fault." "That's what it looked like to me, too." "Then we're not waiting until Saturday for anything," Grubbs said, already moving toward the office light still burning in the shelter's front window. "Get Northcott. Tonight." Elise Northcott was still at her desk past 8 that evening, run sheet spread in front of her under the desk lamp, when Chief Rowan Grubbs walked in without knocking, badge case in hand, though he hadn't carried active credentials in 3 years, and set the logbook down flat in front of her, open to the page, tapping it once with one finger in a gesture that was nothing like the closing tap of Elise's own pen, and yet somehow felt final in exactly the same way. "Read the dates against your own transport file," Grubbs said. "Then tell me your scoring system accounted for a staffing failure your predecessor's predecessor never corrected." She read it. She read it twice, the way a person reads something hoping a second pass will change the first. Then she sat down harder than the chair required, both hands flat on the desk on either side of the open logbook, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all, because every column on her own printed run sheet had been built on the premise that her data was complete, and here in front of her was a hole in it. 3 separate assessments wide, a hole her method had no way to register because her method had never been built to ask whether the record itself might be the thing that failed, not the dog. "I based 4 years of placement decisions on a system I thought accounted for everything measurable," she said finally, and her voice had none of the crisp instruction in it that it carried in the yard that morning. "I didn't build in a way to ask whether the measuring itself started from a lie somebody else told first. No system does, until somebody makes you look," Grubbs said, not unkindly. He set his own signature beneath the transport override line, the ink dark and unhurried, and slid the form back across the desk. "That's mine. Effective tonight. The truck doesn't take this dog Saturday or any other day without a new assessment, done right, with a certified evaluator and a handler in the room who actually knows the dog's discipline." Elise looked up past Grubbs to where Cyrus stood in the doorway, coat still buttoned wrong, hands loose at his sides, having said nothing since he'd handed over the logbook. "You could have led with the flood story," she said, "the chief showing up owing you his own daughter's life. You could have used that an hour ago and saved everyone the evening." "Wasn't mine to lead with," Cyrus said. "Wasn't why I came." She sat with that a moment, the desk lamp throwing its small circle of light over the logbook, over her own run sheet beside it, its neat columns suddenly looking less like math and more like a guess dressed up in a font that made it feel like fact. "Then why did you?" she asked, and it wasn't a challenge this time, just a question she genuinely didn't have an answer for. "Dog needed somebody to keep count," Cyrus said. "Nobody else was doing it." He didn't stay to watch her revise anything. He walked back out through the dark office, past Priya's empty desk, past Austin standing just outside the door where he'd been listening the whole time without being asked in, and out to the exercise yard, where Kestrel lay in her run with her chin on her paws, watching the gate the way she'd watched it every evening that week. He didn't take her out this time. He went instead to his truck, opened the tailgate, and lifted out the folded quilt from under the wheel well where it had ridden for 3 years without ever once being shaken out in daylight, its stitching soft and irregular in places where a hand less steady than it used to be had mended a corner more than once. He carried it back through the gate Austin held open without a word and laid it down inside Kestrel's run, square in the corner where the concrete stayed warmest, and smoothed one edge flat with his palm before he stepped back. He didn't come back for the dog to need him. He came back so she'd know somebody still kept count. Kestrel rose, sniffed the quilt's edge once, twice, and then, with the particular deliberateness of an old working dog choosing where to put her weight down for the night, circled twice and lay down full length upon it, chin resting against the faded, undyed pattern Wanda Dunbar had stitched by a kitchen window some 30 winters before either the dog or the shelter or the shed full of dumped equipment had ever existed. Cyrus stood at the fence a moment longer, watching the rise and fall of her breathing settle into something slow and even. And then he turned and walked back to his truck without explaining any of it, to Austin, to Elise, to Priya, or to Chief Rowan Grubbs, who all four stood at various distances in the dark lot, watching an old man in a wrong-buttoned coat do the one thing none of their systems had thought to measure. 6 weeks later, on a Thursday morning with the wheat already gone gold in the low fields past the county road, Cyrus Dunbar's truck idled once more in the Millrace Creek lot, though this time nobody watched it from across the gravel with a run sheet clipped to a hardboard because Elise Northcott was inside, filling out a different kind of form entirely. A revised intake sheet, still printed, still clipped, but carrying a new line near the top that read, "Handler interview required prior to any transfer or euthanasia tract designation," a line she had drafted herself the week after the logbook surfaced and had fought, harder than she'd expected to get the regional office to approve. Through the shelter's screen door, propped open against the morning heat, that revised form sat visible on the front counter for anyone who cared to notice it, which most people didn't, which was exactly how a corrected record was supposed to look once the correcting was done. Unremarkable, procedural, no longer a story anyone needed to be told twice. Austin Rainey, reinstated to his volunteer shift the same week Grubbs' signature went into the file, walked Kestrel out through the gate himself that morning, no lead required, and handed the restitched harness up to Cyrus without a word, because some handoffs don't need narrating. Cyrus hung it from the rearview mirror, buckle and all, the way a man hangs the one thing in a truck cab that isn't there for use so much as for company. And then he opened the passenger door and stood back, while Kestrel climbed up onto the bench seat and, without any coaxing at all, turned twice and settled herself down onto the quilted bed, folded flat across the cushion, chin dropping onto the faded stitching with the boneless finality of a dog who has decided, finally and completely, that she is not required to keep watch on this particular ride. The farm gate stood open behind them when Cyrus pulled out of the lot, the way it had stood open every morning of the 47 years since he'd come home from a war most of his neighbors had never asked him about. And it would stand open that evening, too, when the truck came back up the gravel drive past the wheat, gone the color of an old harness left too long in the sun, past the fence line, and rolled to a stop in the yard with its engine ticking down into silence. Kestrel didn't wake when the engine cut. She lay curled against the quilt Wanda Dunbar had stitched by a window 3 winters gone, the restitched harness swaying once against the mirror and then hanging still, and somewhere in that stillness was the whole ledger of it settled at last, not on paper, not in a run sheet's tidy columns, but in the particular, unhurried quiet of a debt that had taken 31 years and 11 weeks and 1 locked shed to come due, and had finally, without ceremony, been paid in full. Some debts get paid in dog years, and this one still cleared the books.